Please join me in welcoming Ed Reyes.
Thank you. Good afternoon. We're almost there, so hang in there, folks. The lunch is being served, so we'll try to be quick. It's my honor to be here with you, and it truly is a pleasure to see so many familiar faces. As I look at different folks, I think of different meetings and victories and disappointments and the whole roller coaster of promoting change. But to us, and for us, we have an amazing keynote speaker, Tameka Butler. Tameka Butler serves as the Executive Director of the Los Angeles Neighborhood Land Trust, a nonprofit organization that creates, organizes, and advocates for urban parks and gardens in LA's low-income, park-poor communities of color. Tameka has a diverse background in law, community organizing, and nonprofit leadership. Recently, she was Executive Director of the Los Angeles County Bicycle Coalition. Prior to leading LACBC, Tameka was Director of Social Change Strategies at Liberty Hill Foundation and worked at Young Invincibles as the California Director. She transitioned to policy work after litigating for 3 years as an employment lawyer at the Legal Aid Society Employment Law Center. Tameka serves as the Institute co-director of the New Leaders Council Los Angeles, is a board member of both Lambda Literary Foundation and Trust South LA, and is an advisory board member for the Legal Aid Society Employment Law Center's Fair Play for Girls in Sports programs. Tameka received her JD from Stanford Law School and her BA in psychology and BS in sociology in her hometown of Omaha, Nebraska. I present to you Tameka Butler.
Up a little because I can't see myself. Good afternoon. Is it afternoon yet? Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Let's try one more time. Nancy, you held it down for a lot of people. Let's try again. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Great. So when I was asked to do this keynote, I was a little nervous because being in between you all and lunch means that you have a very little attention span. If I get too close to the mic, you will hear my stomach growling, and so I'll try to be mindful of that and keep it light. And in order to keep it light, we're going to talk about urban segregation. But before we do that, please feel free to tweet vigorously. You can tweet at the Land Trust, you can tweet at me. And the last thing I'll ask you to do is just give a round of applause to Elsa, who is all the ROSAH folks, has put in a lot of time to today and tomorrow, but for me in particular has been my personal wrangler, and has been on me to get my slides together, which I did 10 minutes ago. So let's see how it goes. So again, we're going to keep it light. So when I say, urban segregation and the connection of race and space, raise your hand and just shout out what you think of. What do you think of when you think of segregation, when you think of space and race? Just what comes to your mind when you see
Redlining.
Redlining? What else?
South LA.
South LA, white supremacy. Let's just go there. Let's just go there right off the top. Yes.
Ghettoization.
Ghettoization.
Criminalization.
Capitalism.
I see you, Oscar. Disinvestment. Covenants. Gang injunctions. So we're gonna. I was told I had to talk about all of those things. At some point in different meetings with different people, literally all of those things came up as things that I should try to hit during my growing up as me. And having people who believed in me enough to tell me that I was young and I was gifted and I was black, and that shouldn't stop me from doing anything. But I also think about the way that despite the fact that I had folks trying to uplift me, that when you are a person of color living in this country, when you are a queer person living in this country, when you are the other in any way, you feel segregation and you feel discrimination and you feel white supremacy and like racism, just like heavy rain, right? You know when you get wet and no matter what you do, you can't seem to get warm? That's how it feels walking through this country every day as a person of color. It feels like when you think you're gonna boogie board and it's gonna be epic, and then the wave just takes you out, and you're just way down. My shrinkage is amazing, but when you get hit, that's how heavy segregation feels. When I think about segregation in this country, I also think of my family. I think of my grandmother, not the white lady. The white lady is not my grandmother. It's my wife, and I like her too. But I think about my grandmother who grew up in segregated South Carolina. And I think about the stories she tells me about growing up and about what segregation looked like, what it felt like, what it meant to be in this beautiful place where there were amazing beaches and the black kids just couldn't go. And I think about how that impacted my mother and how that impacted the way my mother raised my sister and I to speak out and to speak up so that we never had to feel that type of segregation and have that heaviness weigh on you in the way that it still weighs on my grandmother's soul. But I also think about the fact that I grew up in Omaha, Nebraska. And usually this is the part where I make a joke about how there are black people there, because there are a lot of white people. Like, there's a lot of white people in this room right now, but there's a lot of white people in Nebraska. And I think sometimes folks like to separate segregation and racism in public space from this era that we don't exist in any longer. But when I think of growing up in Omaha, Nebraska, not too long ago, because I'm very young, but when I think about it, I think about the summer where I was tagged as a young, gifted, and black kid, and I was given a great internship at a law firm because people wanted to help me get to law school. And I remember as I was not learning anything about law, but working in the records department, being an assistant for a lady who needed some extra help, she said to me, "So wait a minute, your dad was in the military?" "Yes." "So where'd you grow up?" "Mostly in Okinawa, Japan." "Isn't that an island?" "Yes." "So what did you and your family do?" "What do you mean?" "Black people can swim." So I may think about my grandmother not being able to go to beaches. And I may want to think about it as something that's so long ago. But right now, in Nebraska, there is a white lady asking me how I lived on an island because black people can't swim. And I have to explain to her, "Oh, we swim. You just never saw us swim because we weren't allowed to go to your pool." But that doesn't mean that I can't swim. Also don't mean I can't kick your ass, but we ain't gonna go there because I'm a professional. I'm trying to go to law school. I can't do it. So when we think about public space, we have to think about that first slide had a picture of a fence on it. We have to think about how these public spaces are supposed to bring people in, but they actually often keep people out. And I remember as I worked this job the summer before I went to law school and I had this conversation, I remember thinking, this is just the way white folks are. They say crazy shit. And they expect us to just smile and continue to work and continue to carry that emotional labor, but also do their physical labor. And if I'm gonna survive in this world, if I'm gonna be successful, I have to make sure I understand the ways of white folks. And not just Midwestern white folks, because Midwestern white folks may criticize them, but they're friendly. They pray for me. And at least I know where they stand. But I had to learn how to deal with the ways of white folks that were well-meaning, great liberals. And so the only way I really knew how to do that was go to law school. Because let me tell you, if you want to meet well-meaning liberal white people, take your ass to Stanford Law School. You'll meet a whole bunch of them. And in my 3 years in law school, I learned a ton of cool things. I learned about NPR for the first time. I learned about, which forks I should eat with first. And I also learned about the ways in which there are so many good people who want to help communities of color, who want to help low-income communities. But they don't want to listen. They just want to come in and tell us what to do. And they want to ignore the history and the culture and the thriving communities that are already there. And law school taught me all of that, but just in case I wasn't completely sold on knowing that I had graduated to the upper echelons of understanding the ways of white people, after law school, I moved to San Francisco, and that city is white. Being a kid from Nebraska, you're like, I'm gonna move to a big city, and it's gonna be so diverse. And then you move to San Francisco, and you're like, where are the black people? They used to be in Oakland, but now they're not even in Oakland, right? And why? It's because of how we use public space. So eventually, San Francisco just became too much for me. Literally, it was really expensive, and I wasn't making a lot of money. And then I fell in love, and I wanted to get married. And I got married to a woman here in LA. And that's how I ended up being the executive director of the Los Angeles neighborhood. So this is a picture of my mom crying. Not because I got married, but because she can't tell her friends I'm a lawyer anymore. She doesn't understand it. She's just like, but what do you do? Like, you moved to LA, started eating salads, you rode your bike everywhere, you convinced people you liked it, and now you work on parks? Like, what are you doing, right? And so, these are the slides again that I have to put in, right? This is what we do at the Land Trust. This is why it's important work for me. Because we're talking about park equity, we're organizing communities, we're building parks, we're managing parks, and we're really developing local folks into leaders. And we're doing it all, not just for park's sake, but to fight historical and structural racism that these communities face. And we've done a lot in the time we've been around. Most notably, recently, Measure A was a huge victory that a lot of folks have talked about. That's going to bring about $94 million annually to parks based on a needs equity assessment. We're really engaged in SB 5, the state water bond, that can potentially bring $170 million. Those are all great things. But for me, it's important to not just think about the successes we've had and what we're doing now, mainly because I've only been here for 2 months, so I can't really take credit for any of that shit. So I like to talk about things that I can take credit for. And there's not much yet, so stay tuned. But I like to talk about our history. I like to talk about the fact that we were founded in 2002, right? We were founded to fight for park equity. And just like I said with my grandmother, oftentimes when people think about equity, when people think about racism, they think about it as this far forgotten thing. They think about black kids and brown kids who couldn't get into parks. They think about Native kids whose land was taken away from them so that other people could build parks that they can't get into, right? And so you look at this image from the 60s and you're like, but that doesn't happen anymore. But remember, the Land Trust was founded in 2002. There was, a rule, maybe not on the books, but it was a rule of practice. The city of LA didn't build parks unless they had at least 5 acres of land. And so what did that mean? That meant in low-income communities, communities of color, communities that are usually highly dense, there weren't parks. And so many kids, even though it wasn't the 60s, were still left on the outside looking in. And that's just not the story of LA. Raise your hand if you've heard of this book or if you've heard of Madison Grant. Just Natalie? So, this book that Madison wrote was all about how Nordic people, white people, are superior. And how the race is gonna be better, and the human race would be better if those people could just have everything. And that immigrants and people of color with their disease and their stupidity were ruining everything. In a letter to Madison, Hitler said he considered this book his Bible. But the other thing that Madison did was be besties with Teddy Roosevelt, was be part of the organization that started the New York Zoo, be part of the organization that started Yellowstone Parks. This dude literally helped create our national park system. So when you think about parks and open space, and you think about the ignorant things people say about how folks can't swim, or, folks don't like to hike, folks don't like to be outside, I don't know why people think black folks can't handle it being outside. We literally made your whole country and economy survive by being outside all the damn time. We can handle it. But we were excluded because the people who started it never wanted us there. And so we can't talk about park equity, we can't talk about affordable housing without talking about racism. And there was this book that came out recently where this white dude was basically like, yeah, the government created laws to exclude people of color in housing. And those ramifications still exist today. I will never be able to amass the same wealth as a white person whose family was able to own a home. And these signs that we see feel like, again, they're so far away. But when I wanted to move to South LA to live around other black people with my white wife, when she filled out an application with her really white-sounding name, Kelly Perrigo, she could look at any house she wanted. When I filled out an application with my really black name, Tamika, I had to have credit checks. I was told the same apartments weren't available. So for folks of color, we know that those policies that were created still impact us. We know that just because people don't say nigger out loud, that's what they think when we come in to look at an apartment. I don't look at apartments without my Stanford hat on and my Stanford t-shirt, my Stanford socks. I just don't do it. And we know that redlining was real. We know that communities were created explicitly to keep people out. And then when policies were put in place, it wasn't just about building housing. It was, where can you put the plants? Where can you put the fracking? Where can you put the things that are gonna make people sick, that are gonna totally decrease life expectancy, increase rates of asthma? Where can you put those things? Not where the white people live. And sometimes, when they were trying to make housing that could only be for white folks, one of their favorite tricks was to use parks. To say, we can't have housing here because we need a park. A park only for white people, but we need a park. And again, those policies still impact us in LA today. When Measure A was on the ballot, you can still look at a map and you can still see the people who don't have access to parks and green space. They're the same people who are being segregated systematically by policies that we want to pretend have unintentional policies, but for those of us who experience the impact, we know it's not unintentional. And it happens with our transportation system. We think about transportation as a civil right because of sister parks, but transportation, our highways have always been used to segregate communities. When you're driving on the interstate system, think about where the off-ramps are. Think about communities that were cut in half. Think about communities where the bus never comes on time. Through housing, through parks and open space, whether it's our national park system, whether it's our national highway system, through transportation, we continue to exclude folks of color and keep them on the outside, right? We knew what sundown towns were. We knew where we needed to make sure we got our asses out before the sun went down. But even though those signs aren't up anymore, the way we're policed is still enforcing those signs. Because now it doesn't matter if it's nighttime or daylight. If people determine that we don't belong, we can disappear. Because there are no ramifications for police who are being reinforced by racist housing policies, racist planning policies, racist transportation policies. So if they want to choke a dude out on the street because he was standing in a public space doing something he wasn't supposed to do, despite the fact that there probably aren't parks in his community where he can just chill with his friends, like my friends can just go chill in Santa Monica where they got all the parks, that's okay. Because it's not just the police department, it's all of our systems and policies that stand to make people of color others. And we literally can't live in our communities without knowing that our communities are killing us. Until there happens to be a new train stop or a new high-rise. Then, all of a sudden, the folks of color who no one wanted to remember, they wanted to make us invisible, and they kept us invisible by keeping us segregated, by keeping us in places that they didn't want to see. But then when they see that new high-rise with no affordable housing in it, that's going to raise prices and realize that it might be a little affordable, they're like, oh, word? Can I live there? Again, this is my wife, so she's a white person I can make fun of. And folks of color, we just laugh because we've been living here. Now you want to build a bike lane, but we've been riding bikes. Now you want to build grocery stores, but we've been looking for fresh food. Now you want to build a train station, but we've been taking 4 or 5 buses over 3 hours just to get to work. But now you want to bring your cute dogs with their little shoes, and you want to come into the neighborhood, sell your craft beer, and you can dress a certain way, and you cannot be policed, but I can dress the same way, and I can be viewed as blight. I can be viewed as unimportant. I can be viewed as a criminal. And let's not even talk about our neighbors who don't have homes, in some cases because of these very policies. We just hope that they go away. These are all things that we see happening in so many neighborhoods. It happens in my neighborhood, in Leimert Park, happens in Boyle Heights. It's happening along the LA River. And it doesn't help when we have conservationists who come in and say, we're going to preserve things or we're going to make things better, but they don't want to talk about the people. They don't want to talk about the culture that's already there, and they don't want to talk about the people that they're continuing to try to erase. They just want to speculate on land. Because for them to have to think about all of these things is too much. How many times have you heard, we're just a parks organization, we're just a transportation organization, we're just a housing organization, we're just a river organization? LaRosa's trying to change that. But a lot of those folks saying that, I'm sorry, are white people who have never been forced to live at the intersections. They don't know what it's like. When I walked into the bathroom earlier, and a few women looked at me because they didn't know if I should be in that bathroom. They don't know what it's like if I have to question, do these white women feel unsafe because they think I'm a black man? Do these white women feel unsafe because I clearly look gay? And I might be, seeing if they're cute. I don't know. But I have to think about all of those things. And so when we have leaders in elected offices are running nonprofits who refuse to think about the intersections of all of these issues, I don't think they're doing their job. And we have to be brave enough to say something, even if it's not our problem. We have to be brave enough to confront our privilege. I know I'm out of time, I'll hurry up. we have to be able to get over our white fragility. I've only been at this job for 2 months, and the number of white people who have cried in my presence because I'm mean, or because I'm aggressive, or because I'm angry. I mean, I just left a bike job because the bike people thought I was too black, and now the park people think I'm too black. Well, I'm just gonna keep being black. And so if folks can't handle the fact that racism exists, and that white supremacy is real, and that we have made historical decisions that continue today, and that we continue to make, because they're too fragile, then I don't really know what to do with you. Find a white friend, cry to them. But for the folks of color whose lives that you continue to tear apart, you gotta get your shit together. I'm going to Canada after this, so these will be my Canada slides. I leave tonight. You have to learn how to say sorry, but then move the fuck on. Do not make these spaces where we're trying to make positive change and do things differently, spaces where we have to listen to your apologies. Have you heard that song? He just goes on and on and on and on. It's like, yo, white boy, Selena Gomez is not taking you back. She's in the weekend now. Let it go. You have to be willing to put in the work. You have to be willing to confront your own white privilege. You have to be able to confront your own fragility. And even those of us who aren't white, we all have privilege. We have to realize that we're all often walking in spaces where we have privilege and where we don't have privilege. And how do we balance both? And how do we put community first while we do that? How do we, especially in a place like LA, where all we talk about is giving different council districts and giving different supervisor districts things equally, how do we actually talk about equity? How do we actually talk about making sure that the people who have historically gotten the least get the most? And how do we get to a point where we can envision a future so radical that we don't even need fucking step stools, that we can all just access all the resources we need? First, you have to, again, to do the work, realize that being an ally isn't just changing your Facebook status every time your president does something crazy. It's actually taking action. It's actually being reflective. It's actually doing something. It's actually not being afraid to look upstream. No one wants to talk about racism. The dude who wrote that Color of Law book, lovely white man, he said, we can't focus on whose fault it is that we have segregation now, because that won't make people feel good. It won't make white people feel good. It'll make me feel real good, to just be honest, right? And that's the thing. No one wants to swim upstream. No one wants to look at root causes, because then we have to acknowledge our ugly history, and we have to acknowledge that even if you're not a racist yourself because you have black friends, that you benefit from white supremacy, that you benefit from systems that keep me out, and you have to be willing to do something about it. And you just can't sit there quietly and do nothing. You can come to things like this. You can come to things like our Park Equity Summit. We're gonna have one in a few months. But more than anything, you have to wake up. Everyone right now is walking around talking about stay woke, fist, stay woke, fist. Like, I don't even think people know what resist or staying woke means. I don't think they understand the trauma it takes for folks of color in this society, for undocumented folks, for folks with disabilities, for Native folks. I don't think they understand that you can never get caught slipping. You can never get caught sleeping. Because you may fucking die. You may be hanging out in the park with your friends as a little boy, and someone may think your gun is real just because you're black, and you may die. You may be riding your bike, you may get hit by a car, you might be the one who gets hit, and you might get arrested because you're black. You can never sleep. You can never get caught slipping. So if you're really committed to everything you're gonna hear about today and tomorrow, towards really looking at these issues intersectionally and doing something about them,
then take action and really force yourself, even though you don't have to, even though you have the privilege to be able to sleep and not pay attention, force yourself to truly understand what it means to be woke before you say it, and then stay the fuck woke. Thank you.
I think it might be unfair to say that the two, sectors have never worked together. I think if I was looking at it most generously, why don't they work together? I would say because funders aren't given enough money to work together. Funders are asking us to come up with very narrow views of what we're doing, and I think that's starting to change. I think we're starting to see that change. I think LA Thrives and the Funders Collaborative have been huge in bringing together folks who say we have to tackle these issues together, and that's helped. If I was looking at it least generously, I would say because of racism and white supremacy, because when you have to, when you don't have to look at issues intersectionally, it's easier not to. And it's really uncomfortable to do it, and it feels overwhelming. It feels overwhelming to think there are so many problems if we look at transportation and parks and water quality and all of these things. It's just too much. And it's always been interesting to me that the folks in power, historically white folks, feel that that's overwhelming, but they're ready to solve hunger in Africa or, take their religion everywhere and convert everyone. Those things to me seem overwhelming and huge. But I think the fact that sometimes folks don't want to have to tackle the uncomfortable conversations has really kept the two parts away from each other.
Thank you. The other question is, how will the integration of land use sectors help to desegregate our cities?
Say that again?
How will the integration of land use sectors help to desegregate our cities?
Well, I think again, if you look at history, the policies that have caused segregation have resulted in problems that manifest themselves in our parks, in our transportation system, in our affordable housing. And so we won't be able to solve the problem without tackling all of those things. And that's what happens, right? Like sometimes you do something, and then the results of that something are even bigger than you could have ever imagined. And so if we know that we lack affordable housing in LA, and that also results in a homelessness problem, that also results and not having enough green space because elected officials are trying to pit parks advocates against affordable housing advocates so that we're fighting each other for scarce resources. But their solution is we're just gonna build more stuff. And when we build everything will be fine. Again, that's not looking at some of the root causes, and that's not being creative and dynamic in your problem solving. And so without integration of sectors, I don't know that we'll ever solve the problem.
The next question Elsa suggested I answer, and it's a question regarding what does building equitable communities mean to me? And I'll ask you the same question. But in light of all that we are learning today and seeing the lack of predictability, given all these resources, for me, the building of equitable communities would mean having the capacity to build a seat at the negotiating table for folks who live in these communities. In the context of the river back in 0102, I recall fighting really hard for inclusionary zoning because I knew that the millions of dollars that were coming in for infrastructure development was going to have a vast impact on real estate. We had already started the Taylor Yards, the cornfields, we started working on Westlake, the MacArthur Park, and we saw the change occurring. So we fought really hard to bring in folks, leveraging what was already going on. Nancy spoke of the promotoras in the southern part of our district. That was a large presence there in terms of getting people involved. So for me, the notion of equitable communities really is about giving respect to the folks who have lived there for 10, 20, 30, 40 years, several generations, and allowing their vision to be part of the discussion of setbacks, heights, how much green space, what kinds of transportation programs, all the impacts that come under the umbrella of the Environmental Impact Report. And understanding the technicalities of CEQA and providing this learning curve for folks who never get a chance to see their neighborhoods from a bird's eye view. And to provide that technical assistance in those perspectives so they could have this sense of ownership that this is being done for them. One of the harshest meetings I've had is when several of the folks that were from neighborhoods came to me and said, you know, why are you doing this? This is not for us. Why are they even paying attention to us? And it dawned on me that they did not think they deserved it. And I said, wait a minute. This is your community. This is what you do every day. Our children are being harassed every day for all these different challenges that they go through just to get to school and back. That needs to change. So for me, equitable communities means being part of that discussion of knowing how to be a beneficiary and to understand the accountability of those same public tax dollars that are being leveraged to attract investment for others who have the wherewithal to defend themselves. So I'll stop at that. But Tamika, from your point of view, how would you interpret?
I think I would agree. I would say the same thing. I think whether or not you're talking about building equitable communities, whether or not you're talking about building an equitable transportation system, or an equitable Olympics, I think that it means going to the folks who are going to be most impacted, asking them what they want, and really being open to the fact that it might not be what you want, and then being able to be responsive to that, and then knowing when to step back, stop talking, and let the folks who are in the community really lead the process and really grow the process. And when I was at the Bike Coalition, folks would always say bike lanes were the first sign of gentrification. And I would always say that for folks in low-income communities and communities of color, it wasn't just the bike lane. It was the fact that it felt like the bike lane wasn't for them. Mm-hmm. That no one had ever cared before, no one had ever, come to them before, and that the city's gonna come in and put in a bike lane. Well, not this city, because we don't do that anymore. But that the city was gonna come in and put in a bike lane, but they can't fix the street lights. They can't, take care of that abandoned lot. They can't do any of these things. And besides that, people have been biking in that community every single day and no one ever cared. And so it's that feeling that you talked about, that folks feel like it's not for them because they don't have any ownership in the process. They were never part of it. No one ever asked them. People just came in with their fancy job titles and their fancy degrees and said, come to our meeting so we can check this off a list. We'll host it at an inconvenient time. We won't give you food. We won't have daycare. We won't make it accessible in any way, including linguistically. And then we're going to do whatever we want because we're the experts and we're here to save you. And for any person of color, every time a white person says they're going to save you, you should probably go the other direction.
So we'd like to open this up for questions and answers. And we've got a few minutes before we have lunch, but any folks out there with questions that you'd like to ask? Everyone's taking a deep breath. All right.
It's so light, no one wants to ask a question.
Too intense. That's it.
Natalie?
Have a microphone over here.
Okay, this one. Hi, America Sebes, again with Proyecto Pastoral. Along the thread that you just mentioned, Tamika, around how community is actually engaged in the process, and I think that's a fair question to raise when we're looking around major city developments and projects that lack meaningful community engagement. And this is, across the board around, across issues. What would you see would be a solution in really addressing the lack of meaningful community engagement, and as a result, we're seeing the negative impacts when we're really not seeing developments that harbor and addressing a lot of the community's concerns. And then once developments are in place, they feel that they're not connected to them.
So, you ask the question one more time?
So essentially, what would be a meaningful community engagement process if we were to dream big and say that we are able to develop a policy that focuses solely around community engagement? Because I feel that community engagement is part of a whole package and it almost seems like we're checking up the box. What would be a policy that would really contain a meaningful engagement process around?
Gotcha. Well, it's not one of those answers where it's one fits all. It's not. Every geographic area, every demographic area has a different set of challenges in how you create dialogue and communication. One of my favorite experiences was working with the local adult school ESL courses in the local high schools. And there we were able to work with the principal and the teachers and make part of their teaching of English the civic process of the environmental impact reports for the goal line stations. There was a huge clash between the folks living up in the hills versus the folks living on the flatlands and how they're going to build that rail line. The engineers, in their infinite wisdom, and I think they meant well, want to get from point A to point B as quick as they could, so they want to put 12-foot walls to cut Highland Park in half and a good part of Lincoln Heights, as if no one lived on the flatlands. But it contained sound, it minimized traffic, et cetera, et cetera. When we allowed this kind of information to get out through the school system, the parents, the folks learning these, taking these classes started to learn about EIR and started in their curriculum, were able to give some feedback at the public hearings. So all of a sudden, the rooms were being packed by people who you never saw there before, mostly people of color. And those walls went away, mitigation was enhanced, but it was the ability to connect with the busy schedules of folks who are trying to survive. They're carrying 2 or 3 jobs. And yet you want them to sit in these meetings, going through flow charts and explanations of this project. They've got kids that are waiting to be attended to if they don't have childcare. A senior at home who they're left alone. So these are the dynamics that, and I was very proud of our office. I was blessed with a strong team. And we sought out the nonprofits. Not one nonprofit was carrying the burden. It was leveraging different resources, but it was capturing their attention at a setting that they were already committed to, and we basically were leveraging their time. So I'm speaking to the notion of access, points of communication, to provide knowledge so that they can integrate their concerns in the process. And that to me was a meaningful way of getting them to buy into and define their own space. Otherwise, I think that wall would be there today.
And I agree. I think there can't be a one-size-fits-all. I think you have to really do it community by community, and I think the only way to do that is to invest in communities. I think that we have to start paying folks to do the work as we would pay experts. So we all know that, they'll bring a consulting firm into a community and they'll pay them a shitload of money, but then they expect the nonprofit to turn up all the folks for that meeting, and they won't even pay you a fraction of what they're paying the consultant. And so I think we have to start making investments in our community groups who know each of their communities the best, and really giving that same respect to them as experts. And for me, and folks who know me know I always say this, it's committing to a model of co-powering rather than empowering. Empowering to me is super colonial. It's very much like, I have the power and I'm going to bestow it upon you, now go forth and be powerful. And the reality is the communities already have all the power. That's where the power is. So we should be co-powering them and working with them, not giving them little scraps to do what we see fit. And I think the last thing I would say on like a bigger level is, again, not to continue to say the same thing. I think we have to really confront the racism. Like, we have to confront the fact that so many, I hated the show Parks and Recs until I started this job. Now I think this shit is hilarious. But before, I was just like, other than Rashida Jones being fine as hell, why would I watch the show? And so much of it is true, and the aspect that's really true is how so much of what we see as community work are these meetings. But the racism that is inherent in our society makes it such that when we see white folks at a meeting being passionate about their communities and what they want to see in their communities, we think they are engaged. When we see folks of color at those meetings being passionate about their communities and what they want to see, we think they are aggressive, we think they are violent, we think they are uneducated, we think they just don't understand the process. And so I think we also have to check and really be okay and frankly hire people in positions who can handle those types of situations, that we allow folks who might have fewer opportunities to gain the same access to folks, the same opportunities to express themselves about what's important to them.
So with that, I'd like to conclude the question and answer. I think they gave us the corton. I mean, that's it. So we do have lunch coming up. I do want to take a moment to say thank you to all of you for all of your hard work, your attention, the fact that you're here. There is change coming, and the question is going to be, how do we become effective in knowing how the committee works, the council works, the county works, and how we integrate all of these resources, because it's going to be very difficult for any one entity or one interest group to do anything. It has to be a coalition. It has to be a leveraged effort. And to see this energy here and the positive sense of what we can do is inspiring. So thank you so much. And thank you, Tamika, for your presence, your insight. And thank you all for coming along tonight.